The forest that should not exist. The captain gathered everyone around the vehicle. 1 hour. The scientists exchanged glances. 1 hour, Alina repeated. 60 minutes, not 61. Professor Arbenko smiled. You sound like a schoolteacher. I sound like somebody who would like to bring everyone home. Nobody argued. The captain unfolded a map across the hood of the pickup truck. 3 teams. He pointed at different sections of the former reservoir. Team A surveys the willow stands. Team B follows the wetlands. Team C documents vegetation along the old shoreline. Why split up? One of the younger researchers asked. The captain looked at the sky. Because a group of 12 people attracts attention. Silence followed. Everyone understood. In another life, the question would have sounded absurd. In this one, it did not. The professor checked his watch. 1 hour, then. The captain nodded. After 1 hour, whatever you discovered, whatever you found, whatever you are photographing, you leave it and return. The scientist signed. Nature spent 3 years creating this forest. The captain adjusted his rifle, and the drone can end our day in 3 seconds. Professor Horbenko brushed a strand of silver hair away from his forehead. Deep lines around his eyes became more visible when he smiled. He looked to be in his early 60s. The scientists walked in single file through a corridor of young willows rising from what had once been the bottom of the Kakhovka Reservoir. 3 years ago, this place had been covered by water. Before that, decades ago, it had been the legendary Veliky Lug, the great meadow of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. Now it was becoming something else entirely. A forest. A forest that should not have existed. Professor Mikhailo Horbenko stopped beside a cluster of silver-green saplings and adjusted his glasses. 6.5 meters, he said. His graduate student Olena raised a measuring rod. Almost 7. The professor stared upwards. 3 years. The words sounded less like an observation and more like a prayer. Alina was already halfway up the slope when Professor Horbenko called her back. You photographed the flowers, he said. Now photograph the soil they are growing in. She smiled. You always notice what everyone else forgets. That's what 40 years of field work are for. Around them stretched thousands of hectares of young wilderness. White willows, poplars, reeds, wild grasses. The earth was still learning how to be land again. Everywhere life seemed to be improvising. Birds soon echoed through the branches. Dragonflies flashed above pools of trapped water. Somewhere deeper in the vegetation, a pheasant screamed. Nature had returned with shocking speed. And yet war remained. The cracking voice of a soldier interrupted the silence. Movement check. Sector clear. Captain Artem Gnatyuk stood on a small rise with binoculars pressed against his eyes. He was not interested in birds. His team had accompanied the expedition from the moment they entered the exposed flat plain. Officially, they were security. Unofficially, they were insurance against death from the sky. The former reservoir lay dangerously close to the front. Russian reconnaissance drones crossed these territories almost daily. Artillery watched roads. FPV operators searched for vehicles, movement, anything unusual. A group of scientists carrying cameras and measuring equipment could easily attract attention. Professor Horbenko crouched beside another willow and carefully measured its height. 6.8 meters. He scribbled the number into his notebook before moving to the next tree. Captain Hnatyuk watched the empty sky through his binoculars. Finally, he lowered them. "How much longer are you planning to stay out here?" 15 minutes. Make it 10. 10 won't be enough. 10 is what you've got. The scientists continued forward. The terrain changed constantly. Dry sandbanks suddenly gave way to wetlands. New lakes reflected the morning light. Young trees stood in dense walls, where only a few years earlier fishing boats had crossed open water. Alina photographed a patch of fresh animal tracks. Wild boar, probably. No, she crouched beside the imprint. Definitely. Another researcher joined her. "Look at the size." The captain glanced down. "I'll take your word for it." He preferred animals he could see. At least soldiers made noise before they killed you. Drones often didn't. The expedition moved deeper into the emerging forest. The trees grew thicker. The sunlight became fragmented. For a strange moment it felt as though the world beyond the leaves had disappeared. No war, no front line, no drones, only wind, only birds, only water. The illusion lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then everyone heard it, a faint mechanical hum. At first it seemed to blend with the wind, then it grew stronger, closer. The soldiers reacted immediately. Every conversation stopped. Captain Hnatyuk raised a clenched fist. Silence. The scientists froze. The sound came from somewhere beyond the trees. Impossible to locate. Impossible to ignore. A drone. Nobody asked what kind. The answer hardly mattered. "Cover!" The order was calm and quiet. That made it more frightening. Researchers slipped beneath willow canopies and crouched behind fallen trunks. Cameras disappeared into backpacks. A notebook dropped into the mud. Nobody complained. The buzzing continued, sometimes louder, sometimes weaker. The forest distorted sound in strange ways. Captain Hnatyuk listened carefully, not to identify the model, not to estimate its speed, only to determine one thing. Was it moving toward them or away? The young forest suddenly felt fragile. The trees were growing fast, but not fast enough. Their trunks were still thin, their crowns still sparse. This wilderness could hide deer, it could hide wild boar. It was not yet old enough to hide people from war. The humming drifted across the sky. A long minute passed, then another. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the sound began to fade, eastward, toward the river. The captain remained motionless until even the last trace of the noise disappeared. Only then did he lower his head. We continue. Several scientists exhaled at once. Alina brushed dirt from her sleeves. The professor remained seated beside a fallen willow. For a moment he watched sunlight flickering through the leaves. Then he smiled. Remarkable. The captain looked at him. What is? The scientist gestured toward the endless green landscape. The forest. He pointed toward the young trees. 3 years ago, everybody talked about catastrophe. It was a catastrophe. Of course. The professor nodded. Thousands suffered. Entire ecosystems died. For a moment nobody spoke. The wind moved through the leaves. But look, He gestured toward the endless green horizon. Nature is not returning to the past. The soldiers listened despite themselves. It is inventing something new. The captain followed his gaze. Rows of young willows stretched into the distance like an army of green spears. The forest seemed endless, alive, restless, growing. "What do you think this space will become?" Alina asked. The professor smiled. "That is why we are here." A bird landed on a branch above them. Faraway artillery thundered like distant weather. The sound rolled across the land and faded. Yet beneath it another sound remained. Leaves. Thousands and thousands of leaves. A forest breathing where a sea had once existed. A forest groaning in defiance of predictions. A forest growing in defiance of war. And for the first time that day, Captain Hanatuk noticed that the young trees were already tall enough to cast shadows. The researchers were already heading back. The hour had passed too quickly. Notebooks were full, memory cards were full, questions were multiplying faster than answers. They were less than 100 meters from the vehicle when the captain suddenly raised his hand. Everybody stopped. A distant bus drifted across the floodplain. The soldiers became alert immediately. The sound intensified. Then came the strike. A flash. A violent crack. The vehicle erupted into flames. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The explosion felt unreal. The pickup truck had been standing quietly beside a patch of reeds only seconds before. Now black smoke climbed into the sky. One of the researchers stared in disbelief. "We were just there." The captain said nothing. He kept watching the column of black smoke rising into the sky. The professor swallowed. Horbenko looked at the burning vehicle. The notebooks in his backpack suddenly felt very light. They had come to document the birth of a forest. Instead, the forest had reminded them how close death had been. Horbenko removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. Life felt very heavy. Separated from the others, Alina moved through a field of last year's grass. Every step produced a dry crunch. The sound seemed unnaturally loud. Alina paused beside a young willow and opened her notebook, adding another brief entry into the neat, disciplined handwriting that years of fieldwork had made almost automatic. The height of the saplings, the density of the stand, the composition of species, the direction of the wind. Each observation seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they revealed a story no single tree could tell. She had just closed the notebook when the distant buzz of a drone drifted across the floodplain. The sound was still faint, almost swallowed by the wind moving through the reeds, yet it was unmistakable. Everyone working this close to the front learned sooner or later to recognize the sound long before the drone itself came into view. And somewhere above it all, unseen eyes searching. For a strange moment she imagined how the landscape looked from the sky. Tiny figures moving through the green, scientists carrying measuring rods, soldiers carrying the burden of keeping them alive, all of them appearing equally insignificant from several 100 meters above. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She closed the notebook. For the first time that day the forest no longer felt ancient. It felt exposed. The expedition reached the ridge overlooking the floodplain just as the sun began to sink behind the horizon. No one spoke. Below them the young forest stretched for miles. 3 years ago it had been open water. Now thousands of willows shimmered in the evening light, their leaves turning silver into the breeze. Professor Horbenko took off his cap. For 70 years, he said quietly, people believed this landscape had been lost forever. Alina looked across at the endless green. And now? Now, the professor replied, it is writing a new chapter. Captain Hnatyuk scanned the sky one last time before allowing himself to look at the forest. He had spent years studying terrain only to answer one question. Where can the enemy hide? The scientists look at the same landscape differently. They saw succession, biodiversity, the return of species, the birth of an ecosystem. Neither of them was wrong. They simply lived in different worlds. A warm wind carried the scent of willow leaves across the flat plain. Somewhere in the distance, a nightjar began to call. Far beyond the horizon, artillery answered. The professor closed his notebook. Next month, he said, we'll have to return. There are permanent monitoring plots to establish. The captain smiled for the first time that day. If the forest is still waiting for us. Alena looked back once more before climbing into the replacement vehicle. The trees swayed gently, as if they had stood there for centuries. In reality, they were younger than the war. And tomorrow, while missiles and drones would once again compete for the sky, the forest would continue doing what neither armies nor dams had ever managed to stop. It would keep growing,